Public housing may be a form of housing tenure in which the property is owned by a government authority, which may be central or local. Social housing is an umbrella term referring to rental housing which may be owned and managed by the state, by non-profit organizations, or by a combination of the two, usually with the aim of providing affordable housing. Social housing can also be seen as a potential remedy to housing inequality. Some social housing organizations construct for purchase, particularly in Spain and to an extent elsewhere. Although the common goal of public housing is to provide affordable housing, the details, terminology, definitions of poverty and other criteria for allocation vary within different contexts. History. The origins of municipal housing lie in the dramatic urban population increase caused by the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. In the large cities of the period, many social commentators, such as Octavia Hill and Charles Booth, reported on the squalor, sickness and immorality that arose. Henry Mayhew, visiting Bethnal Green, wrote in the Morning Chronicle. Roads were unmade, often mere alleys, houses small and without foundations, subdivided and often around unpaved courts. An almost total lack of drainage and sewerage was made worse by the ponds formed by the excavation of brick earth. Pigs and cows in backyards, noxious trades like boiling tripe, melting tallow, or preparing cat's meat, and slaughterhouses, dust heaps, and lakes of putrefying night soil added to the filth. Some philanthropists began to provide housing in tenement blocks, and some factory owners built entire villages for their workers, such as Saltaire in 1853 and Port Sunlight in 1888. It was in 1885, after the report from a royal commission in England, that the state first took an interest. This led to the Housing of the Working Classes Act of 1885, which empowered local government boards to shut down unhealthy properties and encouraged them to improve the housing in their areas. The first public housing project in the world was at one of the most notorious slums of London, the Old Nickel. Nearly 6,000 individuals were crammed into the packed streets, where 1 child in 4 died before his or her first birthday. Arthur Morrison wrote the influential A Child of the Jago, an account of the life of a child in the slum, which sparked a public outcry. Construction for a public housing estate was begun in 1890 by the Metropolitan Board of Works and completed by the recently formed London County Council in 1900. The success of this project spurred many local councils to embark on similar construction schemes in the early 20th century. The First World War indirectly provided a new impetus, when the poor physical health and condition of many urban recruits to the army was noted with alarm. This led to a campaign known as Homes Fit for Heroes, and in 1919 the government first compelled councils to provide housing, helping them to do so through the provision of subsidies, under the Housing Act 1919. Public housing projects were tried out in some European countries and the United States in the 1930s, but only became widespread globally after the Second World War. Americas. Brazil equals. Minha Casa Minha Vida, the Brazilian government's social housing program, was launched in March 2009 with a budget of $36 billion to build 1 million homes. The second stage of the program, included within the Government Growth Acceleration Program, was announced in March 2010. This stage foresees the construction of a further 2 million homes. Of the total 3 million homes, 1.6 million are for families earning between 0 and 3 times the monthly minimum wage. 1 million homes are allocated to families with salaries between 3 and 6 times the monthly minimum wage. And the remaining 400,000 homes are for families earning between 6 and 10 times the monthly minimum wage. All funds for Minha Casa Minha Vida properties are provided by the Brazilian public bank, Caixa Econômica Federal. The bank finances development and provides mortgages for qualifying families. In April 2011, the Minister for Planning, Miriam Belchior, announced that 1 million homes were contracted for the Minha Casa Minha Vida in 2010 and that 500,000 homes would be delivered in 2011. The government budget for the program was $39 billion in 2010 and $40.1 billion in 2011. Canada equals. In Canada, Public housing is usually a block of purpose-built subsidized housing operated by a government agency, often simply referred to as community housing, with easier-to-manage townhouses. Canada, especially Toronto, still maintains large high-rise clustered developments in working-class neighborhoods, a system that has fallen into disfavor in both the UK and US. However, Toronto Community Housing, the second-largest public housing agency in North America, has a variety of buildings and communities ranging from individual houses to townhouse communities and mid-rise and high-rise apartments in both working-class and middle-class neighborhoods. They house low-income Canadians. Following the decentralization of public housing to local municipalities, Social Housing Services Corporation was created in the province of Ontario in 2002 to provide group services for social housing providers. It is a non-profit corporation which provides Ontario housing providers and service managers with bulk purchasing, insurance, investment and information services that add significant value to their operations. Recently, there has been a move toward the integration of public housing with market housing and other uses. Revitalization plans for properties such as in the notorious downtown east of Vancouver, and Regent Park, Lawrence Heights, and Alexandra Park in Toronto, aim to provide better accommodations for low-income residents, and connect them to the greater community. In Toronto, for instance, the aims of the reconstruction plans of Regent Park are to better integrate it into the traditional grid of streets, improve leisure and cultural amenities, and construct mixed-income buildings. However, the residents of these communities have had little effective input in the plans and have had mixed reactions to the construction. In 2014, the city of Vancouver, long considered one of the least affordable cities in the world, changed the definition of social housing to mean rental housing in which only 30% of dwelling units need to be occupied by households that don't have the income to be able to pay market rents. Mexico equals. At the end of the Second World War, enriched by U.S. investments and an oil boom, Mexico had its first demographic boom, in which the primary destination for rural immigrants was Mexico City. Mario Puny Darquay, a famous architect at time, was charged to build its first big-scale projects. Built for the Dirección de Pensiones Civiles y Retiro, the Centro Urbano Miguel Alemán and the Centro Urbano Benito Juárez, both in the Colonia Roma, introduced formal ideas from Le Corbusier's ville radius into the urban fabric. His later project, the Conjunto Urbano Tlatelolco Nonolco, built in 1960 €65, was meant to develop one of the poorest parts of the city, Santiago Tlatelolco, which was becoming a slum. Unfortunately, after a while, instead of giving the residences to the previous residents of Tlatelolco, corruption took place and most of the dwellings were handed to state employees. During the earthquake of 1985, both the Benito Juárez and Nonolco Tlatelolco complexes suffered major damage, with some buildings collapsing. Today most of the multi-familiar Benito Juárez has been demolished. But after all, Mexico has had experience of housing projects since Porfirio Díaz's regime. One of those still remains and is the Barrio of Loreto in San Angel, an Alvaro Obregón Cubden, DF. That was a project for a paper factory workers. Puerto Rico equals. United States equals. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, government involvement in housing for the poor was chiefly in the introduction of building standards. New York City's first houses, dedicated in 1935, were the nation's first public housing project. Most housing communities were developed from the 1930s onward and initial public housing was largely slum clearance, with the requirement insisted upon by private builders that for every unit of public housing constructed, a unit of private housing would be demolished. This also eased concerns of the establishment by eliminating or altering neighborhoods commonly considered a source of disease, and reflected progressive-era sanitation initiatives. Moreover, public housing along with the federal highway program demolished the older, substandard housing of communities of color across the United States. However, the advent of makeshift tent communities during the Great Depression caused concern in the administration. Public housing in its earliest decades was usually much more working class and middle class and white than it was by the 1970s. Many Americans associate large, multi-story towers with public housing, but early projects were actually low-rise, though Le Corbusier's superblocks caught on before World War II. A unique U.S. public housing initiative was the development of subsidized middle-class housing during the late New Deal under the auspices of the Mutual Ownership Defense Housing Division of the Federal Works Agency under the direction of Colonel Lawrence Westbrook. These 8 projects were purchased by the residents after the Second World War, and as of 2009, 7 of the projects continue to operate as mutual housing corporations owned by their residents. These projects are among the very few definitive success stories in the history of the U.S. public housing effort. There are also many New York City Housing Authority efforts that have provided in-demand and inexpensive public housing for decades. See Public Housing That Worked, New York in the 20th Century by Nicholas Dagen Bloom for a rigorous examination of the U.S. Public Housing Management Agency with the country's most extensive holdings. Bloom's Public Housing dispels common U.S. public housing myths while detailing advances made by NYCHA. See also NYCHA's own website Factsheet. 3, for elucidation of the magnitude and scope of their work since 1934. Public housing was only built with the blessing of the local government, and projects were almost never built on suburban greenfields, but through regeneration of older neighborhoods. The destruction of tenements and eviction of their low-income residents consistently created problems in nearby neighborhoods with soft real estate markets. Houses, apartments or other residential units are usually subsidized on a rent-geared-to-income basis. Some communities have now embraced a mixed income, with both assisted and market rents, when allocating homes as they become available. The Federal Housing and Urban Development Department's 1993 HOPE 6 program addressed concerns of distressed properties and blighted superblocks with revitalization and funding projects for the renewal of public housing to decrease its density and allow for tenants with mixed income levels. Projects continue to have a reputation for violence, drug use, and prostitution, especially in New Orleans, New York City, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., as well as others, leading to the passage of a 1996 federal one-strike-you're-out law, enabling the eviction of tenants convicted of crimes, especially drug-related, or merely as a result of being tried for some crimes. Other attempts to solve these problems include the 1974 Section 8 housing program, which encourages the private sector to construct affordable homes, and subsidizes public housing. This assistance can be project-based, subsidizing properties, or tenant-based, which provides tenants with a voucher, accepted by some landlords. Asia. China. In mainland China, the government provides public housing through various sources, such as new housing, abandoned properties, and old flats which are rented at a low price and called Lian Zufang. Additional housing is built by providing free land and exemption from fees to estate developers. The resulting houses are called Jingji Xiyongfang. The concept of the low-cost rental housing can be traced to a 1998 policy statement, but did not truly take off until 2006 due to limited funding and administrative problems. The provision of more affordable housing is one of the key components of China's 12th Five-Year Plan, which targets the construction of 36 million homes by 2015. That program's costs will be split between the private and public sector and are estimated at 5 trillion yuan by Chinese investment bank CICC. Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, public housing is one of the major housing policies of the government. Nearly half of Hong Kong's 7.8 million population lives in public housing. Japan. Singapore. In Singapore, the public housing program, particularly the planning and development of new public housing and the allocation of rental units and resale of existing ownership units, is managed by the Housing and Development Board. Day-to-day management of public housing communities has largely been delegated to town councils headed by the local members of parliament. Most of the residential housing developments in Singapore are publicly governed and developed. Most of the residents in public housing are tenants under a 99-year lease agreement. Europe. Austria equals. Public housing was an important issue right from the foundation of the Republic of German Austria in 1918. The population was faced with a great deal of uncertainty, particularly as regards food and fuel. This led to a significant number of less affluent people to move to the periphery of towns, often building makeshift homes to be closer to where they could grow food. They were called Cenigelers. As the political situation became stabilized with foundation of the First Austrian Republic in September 1919, the Cenigeler movement started creating formal organizations like the Austrian Association for Settlements in Small Gardens. The electoral victory of the Social Democratic Party of Austria in the elections for the Viennese Gemeinderat gave rise to Red Vienna. Part of their program was the provision of decent homes for the Viennese working class who made up the core of their supporters. Hence the German word Gemeinde for municipality building. In Austria, it refers to residential buildings erected by a municipality, usually to provide low-cost public housing. These have been an important part of the architecture and culture of Vienna since the 1920s. Denmark equals. In Denmark, public housing is called Almennyttigt Boligbyggeri and is owned and administered by AP. 700 self-governing, democratic and non-profit organizations by and for the tenants themselves. Many of the public housing organizations in Denmark are rooted in the early history of the labor unions and currently forms about 20% of the total housing stock with c. 7.500 departments countrywide. A membership of a housing organization is usually required to obtain a rental and they are granted with regard to length of membership. Although the buildings are owned and administered by self-governing and economically independent organizations, the state of Denmark is strongly regulating public housing in the country. By law, the municipalities have access to 25% of the rentals, usually reserving them for the poor, the unemployed, the disabled or mentally ill or any other group dependent on social benefits from the municipality. Over the years, these regulations has created many especially vulnerable residential areas so-called ghettos within the country. The Danish public housing has never had any income restrictions, but in recent years new state regulations has made it mandatory for several of them to favor fully employed renters and disfavor unemployed or part-time employed people. This is a relatively new effort by the state to counter the ghettoification, which is now an officially recognized problem countrywide. As in Sweden, state and municipal policies carried out throughout the first decade of the 21st century, has led to an increased privatization of public housing. In many areas, residents have been offered to buy their own flats, thereby effectively changing the status of the property. The privatization of public housing was initiated as part of an ideological program by the right-wing governments of the early 21st century and was launched a few years after the closure of the former Ministry of Housing Affairs in 2001. The former ministry was reopened as Ministry of Housing, Urban and Rural Affairs in October 2011, when a new coalition government led by Social Democrats was formed. Finland equals. The earliest public housing project in Finland was in Helsinki. In 1909, 4 wooden houses designed by the architect A. Nyberg were built on Kirstenkujaa for the city's workers. The residents were mainly working-class families with several children. The apartments had an average of 5 people per room, sometimes up to 8. The tiny apartments were equipped with running water, a pantry and an attic cupboard. Every apartment had its own toilet in the cellar. Electric lighting was installed in 1918. The homes and lives of worker families in Helsinki from 1909 to 1985 are presented in a museum near the Linnanmäki Karantsiiki amusement park. France equals. After World War II, the population increased at a rate previously unknown, the rural exodus increased, while war damage had reduced the number of houses in many cities. Rental prices dramatically rose, and the government made a law in 1948 to block them, effectively ending the economic benefits of housing investment. Rents were gradually deregulated until debate in the 1980s led to the current rental law of 1989 theoretically balancing landlord and tenant relations. However, There was a major homelessness crisis in the winter of 1953-03 and the necessary laws were gradually mobilized, producing high levels of construction almost continuously from the 1960s. Social landlords were a major source of expertise as well as construction actors with links to national and local bodies. The construction industry was at the time inadequate, so political support was needed. It is incorrect to refer to French social housing as public housing. The origins of French social housing lie in the private sector, with the first state aid provided to limited profit companies by the Louis Siegfried in 1793. The originally socialist idea was promoted by some French employers in the second half of the 19th century. Public housing companies followed before the Great War. There are still different social housing movements, public, private and some cooperative. Social landlord organizations all have similar regulation and similar access to government loans, but there are significant differences.